concluded. Questions without notice. Just ask the member for Rankin just to wait for a second while people take their seats. The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. In his statement on the national accounts, why did the Treasurer neglect to mention that today's numbers show that economic growth was below the previous quarter, below average, below what he inherited, and all before the coronavirus hit?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, thank you for that dixer from the member for Rankin, who we know likes to tax a lot, Mr Speaker. We know likes to tax a lot. Now, the reality is this, that in this most recent national accounts for the December quarter, growth was 0.5%. That was better than market expectations, Mr Speaker, and it saw through-the-year growth to 2.2%. Now, in the quarter before the December quarter was the September quarter. What was through-the-year growth for that? 1.8%, Mr Speaker. The member for Rankin is the only person who thinks 2.2 is below 1.8, Mr Speaker. The reality is through-the-year growth increased, Mr Speaker. Through-the-year growth increased. And the IMF, as recently as January of this year, said the Australian economy will grow faster this year and next than the United States, then Canada, then Japan, then Germany, then France, then the United Kingdom. The member for Rankin fails to understand that when Labor was last in government, unemployment was 5.7% and today it is 5.3%, Mr Speaker. The member for Rankin fails to understand that household disposable income in the last 6 months of 2019 had its biggest jump in 5.5 years, Mr Speaker. And the member for Rankin fails to understand that the Australian people want lower taxes, not higher taxes, and there's only one side of this chamber that can guarantee lower taxes. That's the coalition under this Prime Minister.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on global and domestic developments relating to the coronavirus and what action the Morrison government is taking to protect Australians' health from this outbreak?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much to the member for Wentworth, who, having served Australia in the most distinguished way on the international stage, is well aware of the importance of global events and the connectedness of Australia, the fact that we are not immune but we are always prepared as we are now. In particular, in the latest advice, I can now inform the House that over 92,000 cases of coronavirus have been confirmed around the world, particularly with a country like Iran. However, we know that that is likely to be a higher figure because there are unreported and undocumented cases. We also know that there are over 3,100 lives that have been recorded as having been lost, and that the spread has now transmitted to 78 countries and regions around the world, including Argentina, Morocco and Ukraine for the first time. In particular, though, I mentioned Iran. We moved early on Saturday, ahead of most of the world, indeed the vast majority of the world, in putting in place a travel ban. Events of the last few days have indicated that that was the right decision, but that the situation in Iran is likely to be even more comprehensive than had been understood by the world previously. As a consequence of that, following the Prime Minister's request to the Chief Health and Medical Officers yesterday, they've been looking at high-risk cases and recommended, and we have implemented the decision to require all people in Australia who have been in Iran and arrived in Australia since February the 19th to self-isolate. This has been taken as an important and precautionary measure, particularly given that the number of cases in Australia that have an Iranian connection has now increased to 10. Domestically, the Australian cases are at 41, including those 10 with an Iranian connection. Most concerningly, New South Wales Health has identified overnight that a worker from the Dorothy Henderson Lodge, an aged care facility in Macquarie, within the electorate of Bennelong, has been confirmed. 11 residents have been isolated, and tests are being conducted on one patient who is in hospital and another 95-year-old former resident who very recently passed away. As that material is available, it will be provided. But what is important to understand is that on identification, both New South Wales Health and the facility immediately implemented those steps that had been planned, agreed and prepared. And as a consequence, the best possible protection for the residents is being put in place. I want to thank all of those, but indicate that this is a case of planning, preparation and implementation to protect Australians.
Just before I call the next question, the Prime Minister just on indulgence.
Very good. I thank you for indulgence, and I should have done this at the start of question time. I inform the House that the Minister for Home Affairs will be absent from question time today and tomorrow, as he is attending the launch of the Global Principles on Child Protection in Washington and to discuss developments and responses to the coronavirus situation with his counterparts. The Attorney-General will answer questions on his behalf and on behalf of the Minister for Defence.
I thank the Prime Minister. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that Australia's three-decade run of unbroken economic growth that began with the former Labor government will survive his Prime Ministership?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question because, as he knows, the global coronavirus is a very dramatic situation that has been emerging now for these past several weeks. It is a situation which the government has moved quickly to protect the health of Australians. And, Mr Speaker, equally, we have been moving to fully understand the economic impacts of this very significant event. This health crisis, Mr Speaker, is different from others that we've seen before, whether it be SARS or MERS, and that's been confirmed to us in the advice that we've received. And the economic impacts of this virus are significant, and we have seen global financial crises before, Mr Speaker, some 12 or 13 years ago. And this economic impact of this crisis is very different to what we saw in the global financial crisis. There is not a failing of the Australian financial system or indeed the global financial system. There is not the same sorts of issues that went to credit flows in the economy at that time. And, Mr Speaker, importantly, during that previous global financial crisis, which had a very muted effect on the Chinese economy, Mr Speaker, and the Chinese economy at that time during the GFC proved to be extremely important to the Australian economy at that time, Mr Speaker. So, Mr Speaker, there are very real differences between the circumstances we face today and previous circumstances. They are all very significant and serious issues, and that is the way that the government is approaching it in fashioning the responses that we'll be providing. We will continue to ensure that we do everything within the government's power, not just only to address the very serious health effects and the risks to the Australian population, as we have been doing, but also to address the very real and very significant economic impacts. Correct. What this health crisis is doing is disrupting supply chains. It is disconnecting travellers from where they would have otherwise gone. It is disconnecting exporters from their markets, Mr Speaker. It is disconnecting and disrupting the global economy. And we will engage with that, and we will be doing it from a position of strength, as the Treasurer just outlined, Mr Speaker. And we will be pursuing policies that are responsible, that are targeted, Mr Speaker, and will get the best possible outcome for the Australian people.
The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's response to the effect of the coronavirus is focused on keeping Australians safe and increasing our resilience to the economic impacts of the outbreak?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question. This is a global issue, and Australia is not immune from the global health crisis of the coronavirus. But we have got ahead, and we are staying ahead, and we are working together with everyone around this country, Mr Speaker, who wants to work with us to achieve that task. And I thank state and territory governments. I thank also the 4 major banks yesterday, Mr Speaker, who we asked to come to the nation's aid in passing on whatever rate cuts were provided by the Reserve Bank yesterday, which is part of the response that is being provided to this global health crisis and its economic impact. So I thank the banks for following the lead of companies like Qantas and others to address the very real economic situation we're facing. But today's national accounts show that we have entered this crisis in a strengthening economic position, with through-the-year growth up from 1.8% to 2.2% in the December quarter, and that is compared to G7 nations, Mr Speaker. Only the United States had slightly higher growth than Australia through the year, through the December, Mr Speaker. And indeed, in the December quarter, we had the same growth as the United States, Mr Speaker, and higher growth by 0.5% through the year than the OECD average, and in the December quarter, 2.5 times or thereabouts of what the average growth was in the OECD nations in the December quarter. The national wages bill up by 5.1%, the strongest growth in 7.5 years. And average compensation per employee was up at a growth rate which was the highest we've seen in 5 years, Mr Speaker. But employment growth in Australia, which has been the real dividend of the economic reforms and the economic leadership of this government over now more than 6 years, has delivered jobs growth, Mr Speaker, which has been twice the OECD average, which means our government has been putting people into work. Australian households have been getting their balance sheets in order, and many years now they have ahead of their mortgage repayments held in those accounts, Mr Speaker. The government has been getting its balance sheet in order after the disrepair it was left in by those we inherited it from, Mr Speaker, which means we can go into this very real challenge with a balance sheet which is stronger than it was otherwise going to be, stronger than it's been in 6 years, in 10 years, Mr Speaker, as a result of the management of this government in repairing the financial balance sheet of this country, to ensure we go into this crisis as strong as we possibly could, Mr Speaker, and we can deliver the changes and deliver the responses that are targeted, that are measured, that, Mr Speaker, will put and keep people in jobs, that will keep businesses in business. So on the other side of this health crisis, the Australian economy will bounce back stronger, and it will bounce back stronger because of the measures this government is putting in place.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Given today's national accounts show the economy grew at a slower pace last quarter than it did the one before, does he still stand by his guarantee that the budget is back in the black and the economy is back on track?
Members on my left. The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. What I can confirm to the House is that this Australian economy continues to grow, Mr Speaker, and in the national accounts today it grew by 0.5% for the December quarter and 2.2% through the year, Mr Speaker. That is an increase on 1.8% through the September quarter. Now, Mr Speaker, what we have delivered is the biggest tax cuts in more than 20 years, the lowest welfare dependency in 30 years, the first current account surplus in more than 40 years, and the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. And no one can take that away from the coalition, Mr Speaker. The reality is, under the Labor Party, when the member for Rankin was running around...
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. It actually didn't ask about the Labor Party, the question. It asked about his commitment, his mug, back in black, whether it
Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I'll just say to the Leader of the Opposition, there's two issues here. The Treasurer has been referring generally to the economy and the national accounts, and he's able to do that because the question the Leader of the Opposition just repeated then came after a preamble, but equally this is one of those questions that doesn't ask for alternatives. So the Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I can confirm that the budget is back on track, and I can confirm that we've delivered the first balanced budget, and I can confirm that we'll continue to create more jobs and lower taxes under our economic plan compared to what they promise opposite.
Just before I call the member for Warringah, we've just got a couple of welcomes. I would like to Inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable John Ajaka MLC, Vice Chairperson of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the President of the New South Wales Legislative Council. On behalf of the House, a very warm welcome and good to see you again. I also inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Deputy Opposition Leader of the Swedish Parliament, Andreas Carlsson. On behalf of the House, a warm welcome to you as well. And I call the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, I refer to my question last week. To have a balance sheet in order in the future, has your government now assessed the economic impact of a 3-degree warmer world to jobs, to coastal and regional communities? And if you have, what are those costs?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Because of the prospect of a warmer globe, that is why we are taking action, Mr Speaker, on climate change as a government. That is why, Mr Speaker, we need no motivation other than the reality that we understand that we know we need to take action on climate change, Mr Speaker, and that's why we took to the last election the plan and the commitment to a 26% reduction in emissions by 2030, Mr Speaker. And those emissions have now reduced by 13.1% on 2005 levels. Now, it's stronger, Mr Speaker, than we've seen by other countries like New Zealand and Canada, and we have a plan and a commitment which we put to the Australian people to meet that target by 2030. Now, Mr Speaker, in relation to the member's question, while the government is taking action to 2030, Mr Speaker, and is making great progress to achieving that target based on our plan, those opposite, Mr Speaker, do not have a 2030 view about emissions reductions that they can actually share with the Australian people. Not one, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. I'm going to come to you in a second. Okay. The member for Warringah on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Relevance. The question went to modelling of costs, not to alternate plans.
Yeah, I'll just say there's two issues there. It's very similar to a point of order I've just ruled on. It did have a specific question, but it also referred to the question last week, which, whilst I haven't memorised, I remember you raising a point of order on that, and my point was that had a long preamble. But I do say to the Prime Minister it didn't ask for alternatives either, and I'll call the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank you, and I thank the member again for her question, because the question, Mr Speaker, probably would be better put to the Labor Party, who do not have a 2030 target. They want to talk about 2050, and they can't even tell you what they want to happen by 2030. But let me tell you what we're going to do by 2030 and what we're going to do by 2050,
Members on my
Mr
left.
Speaker. What the government is doing is putting a technology roadmap, which is what you need to ensure that you can reduce emissions, not just now, Mr Speaker, but over the next 30 years to address the very issue that the member has raised. Now, those opposite, they have a 2050 target. The member herself may have a 2050 target. She may have a 2050 target, the Labor Party has a 2050 target, but I'm not aware, Mr Speaker, of either the member or the Labor Party having a plan as to how to achieve it. What we have is a plan to reduce emissions not just now, but out in the future. And a key part of our plan, Mr Speaker, is to reduce emissions without putting a tax on Australians, without putting up their electricity prices, and without undermining the industries that so many members on this side of the House, the jobs that they represent in their constituencies right across this country. I'm not going to sell out the jobs of those constituents who depend on those industries. What we're going to do is recognising to take the action on climate change necessary is to get emissions down by the smart process of having a technology plan that sees us reduce emissions into the future. We've got a plan, it's focused on technology. They've got a target, and all it means is higher taxes.
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. Will the Treasurer update the House on today's release of the National Accounts figures? How do these figures show that the Morrison government's economic plan is keeping Australia's economic resilience in the face of economic challenges? And finally, Mr Treasurer, is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question. A great champion of Northern Australia, Mr Speaker. It's somebody who's a great supporter of the reef, a great supporter of the tourism industry, and there's no more enthusiastic supporter of all those crocodile catchers out there, Mr Speaker, than the member for Leichhardt. Now, I can inform the House that in today's national accounts we saw growth of 0.5% in the December quarter. What we saw through the year is 2.2% growth. That was up from 1.8% through the year growth for the September quarter. Now, Mr Speaker, this puts to rest the falsehood that is spread by those opposite that the Australian economy was softening at the end of last year. And in fact, this side of the House believes in the resilience of the Australian economy, and it has defied all those who seek to talk it down. Now, Mr Speaker, this is the sentiment that we agree with. This tide of negativity, relentless negativity from the doomsayers has to stop because it insults the hard work that so many Australians put in to make our economy strong. Who said that? Was that the Prime Minister?
No, it wasn't me.
No. Was it the member for Riverina? No. The member for Pearce? No. Mr Speaker, that was the former Labor Treasurer, the member for Lily, Wayne Swan, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, the reality is, in today's national accounts, we saw household disposable income increase by 2.6% over the second half of last year. Average earnings, which is another way of measuring wage growth, was also up 3%, Mr Speaker, through the year. Now, Mr Speaker, the alternative approach is the high-taxing, high-spending approach of those officers, the fiscal mismanagement, the huge budget deficits. So I was pretty surprised when I had a look at a book by Paul Kelly called Triumph and Devise on page 415, when he talked about the alternative approach from those opposite. And this is what he said about Wayne Swan. Wayne Swan announced the budget would return to surplus in 3 years' time.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition was seeking the call. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Relevance.
No, I'm quite capable of listening to the question and the point of order, and I'll rule on it. So, the Treasurer, he can stand there if he wants, but it did ask about alternative policies, approaches, but what the Treasurer needs to do is relate it to the material he's producing and relate it to alternatives. Member for Chifley's not helping, again. But I won't blame him this time. It's not always deliberate. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the alternative approach is the fiscal mismanagement that occurred on the other side of this parliament on their watch, Mr Speaker. And the reality was that it says on page 415 of this book that Swan's senior advisor, Jim Chalmers, captured the mood. He said he captured the mood when he said the media sell in the budget lockup was easy. Back in black, Mr Speaker. There we had, from the former member for Rankin, running around the budget lockup talking about back in black. The reality is, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we have delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years, more than $300 billion of legislated tax cuts, unemployment that's fallen from 5.7% under Labor to 5.3% under today. Under the coalition, the economy will continue to be stronger.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
The Treasurer is talking about back in black. I'll move an extension of time.
No, he's moving an extension of time, and it's a serious motion. So the question is the Treasurer's time be extended. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The Treasurer. Wait, just wait. I haven't called you yet. I'm just going to address the House. So under the rules, The Treasurer has an extension of time for half of what he had before, so he has a further 90 seconds. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, only one side of this House has delivered more than $300 billion of tax cuts.
Members on my
That is this
left.
side of the House, Mr Speaker. Only one side of this House promised $387 billion of higher taxes. It was that side of the House, Mr Speaker. On one side of the House has created more than 1.5 million jobs, Mr Speaker. It's this side of the House. And, Mr Speaker, there's only one side of the House that saw unemployment rising. It was 5.7%, and it was that side of the House, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, when the Labor Party were last in government, 62,000 small businesses closed their door in the last year. Now, Mr Speaker, under this coalition, more than 300,000 small businesses have been created, Mr Speaker. And under this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we have delivered the first current account surplus in more than 40 years, Mr Speaker. Under this side of the House, we have delivered the lowest welfare dependency in more than 30 years, Mr Speaker. Under this side of the House, we have delivered the biggest tax cuts in more than 20 years, Mr Speaker. And under this side of the House, we have delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. Only the coalition can be trusted to deliver more jobs, lower taxes and a stronger Australian economy.
Members on my right. I'm just saying to the member for Rankin, that sort of might not look good on film, but that's the matter for him. The member for Rankin has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. I ask him again, does he still stand by his guarantee that his budget is back in the black?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, we stand by our commitment to ensure a stronger Australian economy, Mr Speaker. We stand by our commitment to ensure a stronger budget, Mr Speaker. We stand by our commitment to ensure lower taxes, Mr Speaker. We stand by our commitment to create more small businesses, Mr Speaker. We stand by our commitment through this most recent MyEFO numbers and the most recent numbers we saw in national accounts to ensure that the Australian economy continues to deliver for all Australians.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Treasurer, because he's so popular. In light of today's national accounts figures, will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's economic plan has ensured the Australian economy compares favourably with other global economies? Is the Treasurer aware of any other alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call. The member for McEwen.
And I thank the member for North Sydney for his question, who has a background in local government. Mr Speaker is a strong supporter of Australia's tourism and transport sectors and makes a valuable contribution in this place, Mr Speaker. Now, today's national accounts showed that the Australian economy continues to grow. We are in our 29th consecutive year of economic growth. No other developed nation has had a run like we have had, Mr Speaker, where we've got through the global financial crisis, we got through the Asian financial crisis, we got through the dot-com boom and bust, Mr Speaker, and we have seen today's national accounts a 0.5% increase in growth for the December quarter, Mr Speaker, and we've seen growth through the year increase to 2.2%. Mr Speaker, through the December quarter, through the year compared to the 1.8% through the year the September quarter. Now, household consumption contributed to growth today, and we saw an increase in 13 out of the 17 separate categories in relation to consumption. Importantly, 5 out of the 7 discretionary categories also saw an increase. We saw net exports contribute to the growth number today. We saw public final demand, with government consumption, Mr Speaker, increasing by 0.7% in the quarter. Importantly, ownership transfer costs, which is a window into the housing activity, was up by 12.3% over the December quarter. And for those members of this place with mining companies and mining sites across their electorate, we saw a 5% increase in mining investment, Mr Speaker. And machinery and equipment increased in December by 0.9%. Now, I was asked about international comparisons. I can inform the House that just yesterday the OECD singled out Australia and Germany as two countries which could respond to the coronavirus with additional fiscal measures without endangering debt sustainability, Mr Speaker. We also know that the IMF as recently as January was saying that the Australian economy will grow faster this year and next than the United States, than the United Kingdom, than Canada, than Japan, than France and Germany, Mr Speaker. We know when it comes to employment growth, today employment growth is 1.9%. That's nearly twice the OECD average and nearly 3 times what we inherited from the Labor Party. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that in the December quarter we saw our growth more so greater than the OECD average, greater than the euro area, greater than Canada, greater than the United Kingdom. So according to the Reserve Bank Governor, the fundamentals of the Australian economy are very good. Australians can be confident about their economic future. Only the Labor Party will talk down the Australian economy, and only the coalition can be trusted to create more jobs and lower taxes.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My questions to the Treasurer. Given today's national accounts show the economy grew at a slower pace last quarter than it did the one before, and that debt has now more than doubled on his watch, why won't he admit that his inaction and incompetence on the economy means Australia faces the substantial challenges of the coronavirus from a position of economic weakness, not strength?
It's true. The Treasurer will just pause. The member for Warringah will cease interjecting. No, sorry, not Warringah. Sorry, the member for Mackellar will cease interjecting, and don't blame the member for Barara next year. That won't work. Certainly won't work. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I don't know why the member for Rankin seeks to disagree with the Governor of the Reserve Bank. Mr Speaker, I don't know why the member for Rankin will never let facts get in the way of a good headline, Mr Speaker. I don't know why the member for Rankin ignores the most recent numbers in today's national account numbers and ignores the facts that we have seen unemployment at the end of last year come down in December to 5.1%, Mr Speaker. We saw it go down. We saw retail sales volumes have their biggest jump in 2 years, Mr Speaker. We saw in the September quarter household disposable income have its biggest increase in a decade off the back of our tax cuts, and if you combine it with the December quarter, you've seen household disposable income have their biggest increase in 5.5 years, Mr Speaker. We've seen the housing market stabilise. We've seen prices rise, but we've also seen clearance rates increase, Mr Speaker. And the Reserve Bank, through monetary policy and the initiatives that we have undertaken on the fiscal side, have also contributed to a stronger housing market, Mr Speaker. The reality is we have legislated through this parliament against the will of those opposite more than $300 billion of tax cuts, Mr Speaker. We have seen on our watch more than 1.5 million new jobs being created, Mr Speaker. We have seen the first balanced budget in 11 years. We have seen the lowest welfare dependency in 30 years, Mr Speaker. We have seen trade agreements covering, when we came to government, 26% of our two-way trading relationships now cover more than 70% of our trading arrangements. And the relationship that we have struck and solidified by the free trade agreement with Indonesia will help create more jobs, just like the agreements that we struck with China, Korea, Japan and the multilateral Trans-Pacific Partnership. The reality is, Mr Speaker, we have delivered a stronger economy. We have delivered more jobs. We have delivered lower taxes. And Australia is in its 29th consecutive year of economic growth. We're one of only 10 developed economies in the world to have a AAA credit rating from the 3 leading credit rating agencies. Mr Speaker, that is why the Australian people backed us at the last election, because they can trust us with the economy. The member opposite, the member for Rankin, talked about the top end of town, ran around with the member for McMahon promising higher taxes. Only the coalition can deliver a stronger economy with lower taxes and more jobs.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormick government is working to boost the Australian economy through the bring forward of the government $100 billion infrastructure pipeline?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Flynn for his question, Mr Speaker. The member for Flynn, prior to entering Parliament, he's been here 4 terms. He's been here, this is his 4th term. The people of Gladstone and surrounds Emerald have sent him to do a job for them because they trust him. They know how industrious he was when he was delivering fuel to all those outposts, to those businesses. He wasn't one who picketed out the front of a small business. He worked for them. He made sure that they got the delivery of the fuel supplies, the diesel and everything else, because he is a business person. He understands business. He understands when business can have it at the back of the government, then the economy is doing well. Now, this morning, the Urban Infrastructure Minister and I wrote to our state counterparts to bring forward projects of significance, projects be they large or small, to help fast-track, to get fast-tracked and to help the economy. Mr Speaker, for those projects for between 3 and 6 months, we want to get shovels in the ground, excavators busy. We're doing it as part of the $4.2 billion bring forward that we announced last November. And certainly for Queensland, that's certainly going to be beneficial. It complements the existing $26.3 billion that state was receiving as part of the $100 billion 10-year infrastructure rollout. Now, Mr Speaker, we've expedited $118.5 million for the roads of strategic importance. Now, there's a section which runs from Townsville to Roma, $118.5 million. That's going to be so beneficial for that particular stretch of road. The crucial supply road carries 56,000 trailers transporting cattle and 46,000 trailers transporting retail fuel, of which the member for Flynn knows all too well, annually. The $40 million Spring Shore to Tambo project, now this is really important. Sealing of this route will cut 8 hours off the trip and save cattle producers up to $1,400. That's $1,400 that goes straight on their bottom line. And when you're a business person, trying to make ends meet as best you can, $1,400, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And it's good for the cattle industry, it's good for the transport industry. The member for Flynn knows this all too well. And the Mayor of the Central Highlands Regional Council, Kerry Hayes, is a good bloke. He said, belief in our region as a freight route and tourism corridor, this link, talking about the Spring Shore to Tambo route, is critical to the economies of the Central Highlands and Western Queensland. He understands it. He understands how important roads of strategic importance are. He understands how important it is to get product sooner and safer to where it needs to go. The member for Flynn, he gets it too. We on this side of the House, we get it. We understand infrastructure. That's why we're rolling out $100 billion of infrastructure over the next decade. Regional Australia, Central Queensland is certainly a large part of that, because when the regions are strong, so too is our nation.
The member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 6th of January, the Prime Minister promised $2 billion of immediate support for bushfire-affected communities. This week, he admitted his rollout has failed and he needs to rephase and revise his efforts. We also learnt this week that only 10% of his promised funds have been spent. Why has the Prime Minister failed to deliver his promise to my bushfire-affected community?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I thank the member for her question and her ongoing efforts in her electorate in relation to the bushfires, as I do acknowledge the efforts of all members across this chamber for the support they're provided in those communities so terribly affected by the bushfires. But I have to correct the member on some of the matters that she's raised in her question and the misrepresentations made in her question. Of the $2 billion that were committed as part of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency and the fund that was established for that, there was $2 billion, and the phasing of that expenditure was $500 million in this financial year, Mr Speaker. And I can confirm, as was confirmed at estimates, that some $205 million of that $500 million in this financial year, which was phased to be spent this year, has already been spent. Mr Speaker, we're in the first week of March. We committed these funds 2 months ago, and we've spent $200 million already in the last 2 months, and $500 million is the allocation for this 6 months to the end of June 30. and I can go through them, Mr Speaker. $21 million in education support, $7 million for volunteer payments for rural firefighters, financial counselling support of $5.5 million, emergency relief funding of $25.6 million, a mental health package of $10.4, a primary industries grants program that has already rolled out $43.5 million, Mr Speaker, $2.9 million, and this is the program where we need to rephase this program and re-engineer it based on the feedback we've had on the ground. $2.9 million has been provided under the Small Business Disaster Recovery Grants. In tourism domestic marketing, Mr Speaker, we have already been able to provide, together with local area grants, local government area grants, $62.5 million, and for wildlife and habitat recovery, some $26.6 million. Now, when we go specifically to the primary producer grants in New South Wales, I can confirm, Mr Speaker, that there has been $39.2 million provided to 672 applicants for grants under the primary producer program. In the small business grants, Mr Speaker, as those opposite know, and as was the case whether it was Cyclone Yasi or the North Queensland floods or any of these other disasters, including bushfire disasters, in order to be eligible for small business grants, there needed to be direct damage provided by that fire event, that physical activity. That is the same rule that is applied on both sides of the House when these grants have been considered. The nature of these fire events has produced a different effect in these communities. That is the feedback we've got from on the ground, and that's what the Minister for Emergency Management, myself and former AFP Commissioner Andrew Colvin, working together with people like the member for Bega, Andrew Constance, and we've been working on a revision to that program. And I look forward to making the announcements, Mr Speaker, to addressing those issues that have been raised. The government will continue to listen carefully and will continue to make changes to programs as necessary to deliver that support as needed.
Has concluded. I call the member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's plan to accelerate infrastructure spending that will drive jobs, strengthen the economy and get people home safer and sooner?
The Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure.
Well, can I thank the member for Chisholm for her question and for her incredible work that she does for her community and indeed right across Australia, and particularly in relation to the coronavirus in recent weeks. It has truly been remarkable the work that she has been doing. Mr Speaker, last year the Prime Minister formally approached the states and territories and asked them if they had infrastructure projects that they could bring forward in order to get construction and more jobs going more quickly. As a result of that, late last year we announced $4.2 billion worth of either new money or money which we could bring into the forward estimates that otherwise was not. And that, Mr Speaker, has enabled significant projects to get going now which otherwise would not have been underway. For example, next week we'll be formally starting the construction of the Stage 2 of the Monash. Now, I know the member for Latrobe is particularly interested in this. This is a $1.3 billion project, and it will support 1,000 jobs. This will begin next week, and it's only able to begin because of the decision which we made late last year to add a further $184 million to that project, which enables the construction to get going and those 1,000 jobs to kick off and get going immediately. Similarly, with the massive North East Link project in Melbourne, a $16 billion project, which I know the member for Chisholm and the member for Menzies are interested in.
Minister will just resume his seat for a second. The member for Macarthur on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The major nation-building infrastructure
the member
project...
for Macarthur will resume his seat. It's not a sort of free-for-all, after-dinner conversation. The minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, it's good that he's awake at least today. The North East Link, a 10,000...
the minister will withdraw.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
He's withdrawn.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the North East Link, another massive project which will be able to get underway this year because we've brought forward money in relation to that. Similarly with the Gold Coast Light Rail Stage 3A in Queensland. Similarly with the Tonkin Highway over in Western Australia, and so many other projects. Again now, Mr Speaker, we are going back to the states and territories. The Deputy Prime Minister and I have again formally approached the premiers and the infrastructure ministers at the state level, along with the councils, to say to them, are there further projects that they can bring forward to get going in the next 3 to 6 months? We want those projects to get underway. We want to partner with our delivery agencies, be they state and territory governments or local councils, to get those projects underway. Because if you do, it means more jobs, it means a stronger economy, and of course it enables people to get going, get home sooner and safer, Mr Speaker. It's all part of our $100 billion plan, which we are delivering on this side of the House.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Did General Campbell, the Chief of the Defence Force, speak personally to the Prime Minister to object to the use of Australian Defence Force imagery in the Liberal Party's bushfire advertisement the Prime Minister published on the 4th of January and remains published online to this day?
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me correct the member. The Liberal Party did not post an advertisement, Mr Speaker, at all.
Members on my left.
Mr Speaker, let me read the text of the post that the member referred to. This is what it says. It says, 1, we're calling out up to 3,000 Defence Force reservists to help in fire-affected areas. 2, we've also
Prime Minister,
deployed
just pause
3...
for a second. Prime Minister, pause for a second. I'll take members back to yesterday. I need to listen to the answer, or I'll eject those interjecting rapidly. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 2, it said, we've also deployed 3 Australian Navy ships and multiple defence planes and helicopters to assist the states with the response. 3, an extra 20—
The Prime Minister will just pause for a second. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister, the Manager of Opposition Business, on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, the question goes specifically not to whether or not the ad existed. We know that. The question goes to whether or not there was a conversation with General Campbell.
And I'm just going to say to the Manager of Opposition Business, I've given him a fair go to explain his point of order, but if you have in a question something that the responder wishes to contest, they're entitled to. They really are entitled to if they believe there's a factual inaccuracy in the question. It's not for the Speaker to judge the accuracy of questions, but the practice and the standing orders make it very clear, certainly the practice, that those asking questions need to vouch for the accuracy, and if the Minister or the Prime Minister believes that something in the question isn't accurate, they're entitled to address that. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 3, it said an extra $20 million to lease 4 new firefighting planes for current and future requests. 4, that on top of the $26 million already committed this year that was on, Mr Speaker. 5, that means 140+ aerial firefighting aircraft in operation across Australia. 6, paying volunteer firefighters up to $6,000 for lost income. 7, 5 million P2 face masks made available for bushfire smoke, and 8 emergency payments to those who have lost homes or income due to fires, Mr Speaker. This was important information communicated to the Australian people. I observed, Mr Speaker, the requirements of the Australian Electoral Act that any such videos need a proper authorisation, and that authorisation was provided. And if you need any proof of that, Mr Speaker, a couple of days before I made that post, the Leader of the Opposition made this post, listening to people, respecting people—
No, the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is— Members on my left. The member for McEwen can leave under 94A. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. This is about—
Well,
it goes to relevance, Mr Speaker.
But there's already been a point of order on relevance.
It goes to whether he's treating the head of the Defence Force with
the Leader of the
contempt.
Opposition will resume his seat. There can only be one point of order on relevance, and that was taken earlier. The Prime Minister.
The point being made about the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, is they've misrepresented this as a political advertisement, as they stated in their question. Mr Speaker, 2 days before, the Leader of the Opposition posted a video on bushfires and it was titled "Authorise Anthony Albanese."
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business, members on my right, the members for Brisbane. Just before I'm going to give you the call in a second. The member for Isaacs needs to withdraw that reflection.
I withdraw.
The Manager of Opposition Business was seeking the call. I now give him the call. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, I refer to your earlier rulings about when other alternative policies are not referred to, and say that what the Prime Minister is doing now is a breach of those earlier rulings.
Right, and I'll just say to the Manager of Opposition Business, I've been very careful, and I've been obviously, last week pulled up the Minister for Agriculture on exactly that point. There's a key difference here. I realise, and I have been listening very closely. The Prime Minister is not referring to an alternative policy. He is contesting a factual claim in the in the question, saying it's not an ad. Interjecting on me is the worst thing you can do. He's contesting a fact in the question. He's read through some material, and what he's now doing is seeking to show that what he did was no different to what others do. That's how so it's not an alternative policy. Whatever you want to call it, you didn't call it a policy in the question. The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker. So when the Leader of the Opposition makes posts on bushfires, Mr Speaker, it says authorised by Anthony Albanese, ALP, Canberra, Mr Speaker. The only AAA rating this guy knows about is it's always about Albanese.
The member for McMahon. I just say, member for McMahon, I just say to the Prime Minister that last line of the question has offended earlier rulings I've made about referring to members by their correct titles, and I just warn all ministers on that front. I'll just finish, okay? Yeah, and I don't want ministers to think that they can offend that earlier ruling by making it the last line of their answer. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. It goes to the Prime Minister's answer. I'd ask him to table any misuse of Defence Force visuals that I've made in any post.
No, I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, he can seek leave to table anything he wants, but if he wanted to do that, he'd need to ask that in a question. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's stable and certain economic plan is getting more Australians into their first home?
The Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Boothby for her question. She is a champion for first-home buyers, not just in her electorate but throughout South Australia. And, Mr Speaker, since the re-election of the Morrison government, we have seen a sustained improvement in the Australian housing market. We have seen sustained confidence improving in the Australian housing market, and pleasingly, Mr Speaker, that is being driven by first-home buyers. First-home buyers who are confident in the economic plan of the Morrison government. And it's also worth adding, without the spectre of Labor's housing taxes on the agenda, that confidence has rushed back into the market. Part of that, though, is our very successful implementation of the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme. From the 1st of January, 10,000 first-home buyers each year are able to get into their first home with a deposit of as little as 5%. Because on this side of the House, we understand that one of the biggest challenges for first-home buyers in purchasing their first property is getting that deposit together. In fact, In Melbourne, it's been taking up to 8 years for people to save for their deposit. In Sydney, up to 10 years. And since that time, the 1st of January, when the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme launched, we have had 7,031 first home buyers who have now signed up. Very pleasingly, the Prime Minister and I, and in fact the member for Latrobe, had a wonderful opportunity to meet some of those 7,000 first home buyers just a few weeks ago. In fact, the Prime Minister and I met Lisa and her 2 primary school children, 2 beautiful children, where she told us that by participating in the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, she estimates that she's been able to buy her first home 4 years ahead of where she would have been otherwise. It was wonderful meeting Lisa and her family, but there are thousands of those stories around the country. The member for Boothby who asked the question might be pleased to know that there's 282 successful first home buyers under the scheme in South Australia. In New South Wales, over 2,000, in Queensland 1,200, Victoria nearly 1,500, Western Australia nearly 300, and throughout the country. In fact, there are 7,000 throughout Australia who are able to get into their first home because of the work of the Morrison government bringing forward their purchase by many, many years. There are 27 lenders who offer guaranteed loans. There are 2 large banks, but 25 smaller lenders to make sure that this gets coverage across the country. The Liberal and National parties are the parties of first home buyers and home ownership. We are the greatest friends to first home buyers, and the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme will continue to support first home buyers in Australia.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's earlier answer. Did General Campbell, the Chief of the Defence Force, speak to the Prime Minister personally to indicate that he was, and I quote, discomforted by the use of Australian Defence Force imagery in this post?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I talk to the Chief of the Defence Force very regularly, Mr Speaker. Very regularly.
Members on my left.
And when I have private discussions with the Chief of the Defence Force, I respect those private discussions, Mr Speaker. And when he raises whether these issues or any other issues, I always respect and thank him very much for the advice that he provides me with those matters. And, Mr Speaker, we seek to ensure that we reflect in our own actions the advice that we're provided. Now, Mr Speaker, the other thing I've listened very carefully to the Chief of the Defence Force about is the need to ensure we boost our defence capability in this country. And, Mr Speaker—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
While it's on direct relevance, while the information the Prime Minister is now providing is important, it is not relevant to the question that he was asked. We're simply asking for a straight answer to a simple question. There was no preamble in this at all, and the issue that allowed him to go off on a tangent in the previous question is not in this question.
I just say to the Prime Minister, I agree with the Manager of Opposition Business in this regard. It was a very specific question. I do say to the Manager of Opposition Business the Prime Minister is not required to give a yes or no answer, and I believe at the beginning of his answer he was directly relevant to the question. There's no question about that, but this is not an opportunity to talk about other matters, given that there was no preamble. The Prime Minister's completed his. The member for Lindsay.
Mr Speaker.
The member for Lindsay will pause for a second. The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is responding to the outbreak of the coronavirus by assisting in infectious disease research and the development of a vaccine?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. Australians can be reassured that our government has been on the front foot in responding to this disease and the challenges that come with us. We haven't waited to respond. We've taken practical steps to ensure that we are in the best possible position to respond to the very serious challenges of this outbreak of coronavirus. there has been a very coordinated response from this government. That includes responses from health, responses from border security, responses from trade, responses from foreign affairs and, of course, responses from industry. Now, this is a situation that requires daily assessment and it requires ongoing action, and Australians should be assured and reassured that we are in the strongest possible position that we can be to deal with this very serious challenge. And that's because over the years we have done the hard yards that have been needed, including investing in our science and research agencies that are world leaders in infectious disease study and control. What this has meant is that we are in a position to lead when it comes to finding a suitable vaccine. Now, on Monday, I indicated to the House that we had been in close consultation with the international body that has been tasked to develop the vaccine. Our contribution has already been significant. We were the first to grow the virus outside China, and we've shared this with other world researchers. We've developed a promising vaccine, and that vaccine candidate is currently undergoing testing at CSIRO's state-of-the-art facilities in Victoria. Mr Speaker, CSIRO has been on the front line of biosecurity and infectious disease research for 100 years. The infectious diseases previously unknown in humans have been increasing steadily over the last 3 decades, and more than 70% of these emerging diseases are being passed from animals to people. Now, reducing infectious diseases threats and improving our biosecurity protects both our community, so all Australians, everyone who's here, as well as our farming industries. We've been investing in this for many years over successive governments, and it's an investment that we can be proud of, and which means that we are now in the strongest possible position to deal with this very serious issue. We are working in a very coordinated way. We are facilitating rapid responses on many fronts. Mr Speaker, what I can say is that just as our scientists and researchers are serious about what they are doing, this government is serious about what we are doing to protect them.
The minister's time. The member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today the Sports Minister told Senate estimates he met with 2 staff from the Prime Minister's office at 6 p.m. last night to discuss how to handle questions about sports rorts. Did the Prime Minister know before or after that meeting that the Parliament had been misled about sports rorts lists sent to Sports Australia on the day the election was called? Can the Prime Minister confirm that his office is coordinating the cover-up?
I just call the Leader of the House. Leader of the House has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, that last part of the question clearly is something that would have to be moved by substantive motion, because it is a direct accusation of wrongdoing.
Yeah, I'm going to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, to the point of order, I'm not aware of any precedent which would prevent us asking about the Office of the Prime Minister trying to cover something up. This exact issue about false information having been provided to the Senate has been subject to discussions in committee in the other place, and to follow up the direct role of the Prime Minister's staff in it, it would be a very new precedent, I suspect, if this were not in order.
Yeah, I'm just going to say to both the Leader of the House and the Manager of Opposition Business, whilst the language in the last part of the question's not desirable, I think there are many precedents for it. The reason I was considering it is whether it was really going to an allegation of criminality or anything, which would have to be moved by substantive motion. But I've got a long memory, and I'm almost certain, I'm happy to check, that this term was used a number of times over a number of issues, including sort of back into 1993 and 94. That's my recollection, so I think the Hansard would reflect that. So the question is in order. The Prime Minister has the call, but I point out there are a number of questions there, not just the last bit I've focused on.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The more desperate the Labor Party become on this, Mr Speaker, the more feeble their accusations become in this place, the more desperate they come and the more extreme language they use when they come to this dispatch box, Mr Speaker. The tone of that question and the mistruths in that question only reflect poorly on the member and the desperation of the Leader of the Labor Party. Now, Mr Speaker, let's be very clear here. Mr Speaker, the Auditor
Member
General
for Isaacs is warned.
Conducted a serious report into this matter. All the recommendations of that report were adopted by the government and are being implemented by the government. The Auditor General, Mr Speaker, that had access to all the materials, the Minister's report, all the correspondence, found none of the matters that the member was alleging in that question. None of them, Mr Speaker, in relation to me or my office, Mr Speaker. The ANAO had access to all of these things, Mr Speaker, and they made no such finding. I asked the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to investigate this matter into the statement of ministerial standards and any possible breaches of the ministerial standards, and the minister, when I presented those findings to her, resigned as the minister. Now, Mr Speaker, I have taken this matter extremely seriously. We have adopted the recommendations of the report. A further inquiry was initiated and the minister resigned from her
Member
post.
for Sydney.
One side of the House is taking this matter very, very seriously and has taken the actions that are necessary. The other side of the House is just engaged in a desperate political smear campaign to prop up what is a very feeble leader of the Labor Party.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is helping maintain the resilience of Australia's resource sector in the face of significant global challenges?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for their question. And in the member for Herbert, we have another fighter for the North on the coalition benches. Another fighter for the North. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about the resources sector, and under the coalition's stable economic management, the sector is booming. It is absolutely booming. It is providing essential economic contributions. It's generating opportunities for current and future generations. Now, by the numbers, Mr Speaker, $33 billion of investment in 2018-19, accounting for 27% of Australia's total business investment, private business investment. 245,000 jobs in Australia, one of the fastest growing sectors in our economy. Weekly earnings, on average, $2,600 a week. Now, that is a significant and substantial contribution, more than double the average of full-time weekly earnings across the country. Now, Mr Speaker, we have a resilient resources sector. We have mature markets, we have a quality product, and it will continue to be shipped right around the world because there are markets in need that are desperate for what we supply from this country. Mr Speaker, there's a couple of words that make the opposition very uncomfortable. It makes them squirm in their seats, they move around, they look at their phone, and the first one of those is coal. Coal, Mr Speaker. I'll say it again, coal. Coal employs 54,000 people in direct jobs, 54,000 in regional areas, and we know those opposite simply don't support it. It contributes $6 billion in royalties, $6 billion towards schools and hospitals and roads. What a significant contribution. Now, regardless of whether it's critical minerals or coal or other sectors and resources, Mr Speaker, the other word that makes them uncomfortable is Adani. Adani. Now, Adani, those opposite didn't support. Adani they did not support, but this is a business which is expanding. It is expanding. It has already got $750 million worth of contracts announced that is supporting existing and new businesses in central Queensland, Mr Speaker. The Adani mine already has 200 workers on site, and 22% of those, according to Adani reports, are for Indigenous workers. Now, what a contribution to the Australian economy that those opposite did not want. So, Mr Speaker, we stand with the resources sector. Those opposite do not. We stand with the workers in Australia in the resources sector. Those opposite do not. We stand for expansion and economic growth. Those opposite do not. And, Mr Speaker, what we know is I've probably been a little bit unkind to those opposite, probably a little bit unkind. I know there's a few of them that might support the resources sector. They might meet once a week at the Otis
Just
restaurant.
remind the minister he wasn't asked about alternatives. He's sort of
Thank you, Mr Speaker, but it's important to recognise when we compare and contrast that we stand for resources, those opposite do not. In fact, given your earlier ruling, I just have to say that we know and that we can use the hashtag no coal, no member for Hunter. I couldn't use the opposite use, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member's time has concluded. The Prime Minister
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister. The Leader of the House with papers.